Eduardo Patterson was 48 years old, and until 3 months ago, he thought he knew everything about his wife of 23 years. He was wrong, dead wrong. And the secret she'd been keeping every Tuesday for 2 decades would shake their marriage to its core and resurrect a betrayal he thought they'd buried 15 years ago. It started the way most suspicions do, with something small, something so insignificant that most people would brush it off. But once Eduardo noticed it, he couldn't unsee it. Alita left the house every Tuesday at exactly 10:47 a.m. Not 10:45, not 10:50, 10:47. Like clockwork, for 20 years. Eduardo was an operations manager at a mid-sized manufacturing firm outside Chicago, the kind of job that paid the bills but didn't make headlines. Alita worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a dental practice, flexible hours that let her manage her own schedule. They lived comfortably in their 3-bedroom house in Naperville, not rich but stable. 2 kids, both in college now. A decent life, an honest life, or so Eduardo thought. The Tuesday routine hadn't bothered him for years. Everyone has their patterns, right? Alita said she ran errands, hit the grocery store, grabbed lunch with her sister occasionally. Normal stuff. He'd been working from home more often since the pandemic, and that's when he started noticing the precision of it all. 10:47 a.m., every single Tuesday. She'd grab her purse, check her phone, and disappear for exactly 2 hours and 13 minutes. He'd timed it without meaning to, his project manager brain automatically tracking patterns. At first, Eduardo felt ridiculous for even paying attention. This was Alita, his Alida, the woman who'd stood by him through his father's death, through the layoff in 2015, through their daughter's medical scare. The woman who still left him little notes in his lunch bag and remembered how he liked his coffee. But something nagged at him, something he couldn't quite name. Then came the Tuesday morning that changed everything. It was early November, unseasonably cold for Illinois. Eduardo had called in sick to work, a legitimate stomach bug that had kept him up most of the night. Alita had been attentive, bringing him ginger ale and crackers, checking his temperature. Around 10:30 a.m., she came into the bedroom, already dressed in her nice jeans and the navy blue cardigan he'd bought her last Christmas. "I'm heading out for a bit, honey," she said, her voice casual. "Need anything while I'm out?" Eduardo shook his head, watching her from the bed. "Where are you going?" The question hung in the air for half a second too long. Alita's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just errands. The usual." "Which usual errands?" "Eduardo." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "Since when do you interrogate me about grocery shopping?" "I'm not interrogating. I'm asking. Bank, post office, maybe grab some coffee." She kissed his forehead. "I'll be back around 1. She left at 10:47. "I am exactly." Eduardo lay there for 10 minutes, his stomach churning with something that had nothing to do with the flu. The bank. She'd said the bank, but their accounts were all online now. They'd switched to mobile deposit years ago. Alita hadn't stepped foot in a physical bank branch in years, as far as he knew. Why would she go every Tuesday? He got out of bed, moving carefully on shaky legs. Through the bedroom window, he watched Alita's silver Honda CR-V pull out of the driveway. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time, and he'd been too comfortable, too trusting to see it. Eduardo grabbed his phone and pulled up their bank app. Joint checking account, normal activity, groceries, utilities, the usual stuff. Savings account, steady, nothing unusual. He checked their credit card statements next, scrolling through weeks of transactions. Everything looked normal. Standard purchases, reasonable amounts. Nothing that screamed affair or secret gambling problem or any of the things his mind was racing toward. But if everything was normal, why did his gut feel like it was tied in knots? He thought about his brother's words from 5 years ago, at a family barbecue after too many beers. "Man, you're lucky Alita's so stable. My ex-wife had a secret credit card I didn't find out about until the divorce. $23,000 in debt. Can you imagine?" Eduardo remembered laughing it off, defending Alita, saying she'd never do something like that. And he'd believed it, still believed it. Alita wasn't reckless. She was practical, organized, methodical. That was one of the things he'd always loved about her. But methodical people don't drive somewhere every Tuesday for 20 years without a reason. If you enjoy stories of shocking family secrets, hidden betrayals, and the cold-blooded truth that tears marriages apart, like this video and kindly subscribe to the channel now. There are brand new stories here every day that you will enjoy, each one more intense than the last one you watched. And tell me where you are watching from and what is interesting about your city. Eduardo made a decision. Maybe it was the fever making him reckless. Maybe it was 23 years of building trust that needed to be validated. Or maybe it was the tiny, terrible voice in the back of his mind that had been whispering for months that something wasn't right. He was going to follow her next Tuesday. The week crawled by. Eduardo went to work, came home, had dinner with Alida, watched TV beside her on the couch. Everything was normal. Alida was Alida, warm, attentive, occasionally distracted by her phone, but no more than usual. They talked about their son's psychology midterms, their daughter's new boyfriend, the leak in the basement they needed to get fixed. Ordinary life, ordinary marriage. But Eduardo couldn't stop thinking about Tuesdays. He started paying closer attention. On Wednesday, Alida mentioned she needed to renew her driver's license. Thursday, she complained about the price of heating oil. Friday night, they went out to dinner at their favorite Italian place, splitting a bottle of wine and laughing about the couple at the next table who were clearly on a disastrous first date. Alida held his hand across the table, her thumb tracing circles on his palm, the way she'd done since they were dating. "You okay?" she asked. "You've seemed off lately." "Just work stress," Eduardo lied. "New project timeline's been brutal." "You work too hard." She squeezed his hand. "Promise me you'll take it easier." He promised, and hated himself for lying. Monday night, Eduardo barely slept. He lay beside Alida, listening to her steady breathing, watching the rise and fall of her shoulders in the darkness. Who was this woman? Did he really know her at all? Or had he been sleepwalking through their marriage, assuming loyalty meant truth? Tuesday morning arrived cold and gray. Eduardo called his assistant at 7:30 a.m., saying he needed to work from home for the day. A client call that required privacy and quiet. It wasn't entirely a lie. He did have calls scheduled, but he moved them to the afternoon. Alida made them breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, chatting about a funny TikTok video their daughter had sent her. She was wearing different clothes than usual, not her typical errand-running outfit of leggings and a sweatshirt, but dark slacks and a burgundy blouse. Nice clothes. Clothes you'd wear if you wanted to look put together. "You look nice," Eduardo said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "This old thing," Alida laughed. "I have a lunch thing with Linda later. Didn't want to look like a slob." Linda, her sister. That checked out. Or did it? Eduardo realized he hadn't actually spoken to Linda in weeks, maybe months. At 10:45 a.m., Eduardo was in his home office, positioned where he could see the driveway through the window. His laptop was open to a spreadsheet he wasn't actually reading. His car keys were in his pocket. His heart was hammering against his ribs. 10:47 a.m., right on schedule. Alida walked out the front door, purse over her shoulder, phone in hand. She climbed into her CRV, backed out of the driveway, and headed east toward downtown Naperville. Eduardo waited exactly 90 seconds. Then he grabbed his jacket and followed. He kept 3 cars back, feeling ridiculous and cinematic and terrified all at once. This was his wife, his partner, the mother of his children, and here he was, tailing her like a private investigator in a bad movie. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he was this close to understanding what the hell had been happening every Tuesday for 20 years. Alida's car turned onto Washington Street, then onto Jefferson Avenue. Eduardo's pulse quickened. She was heading downtown toward the cluster of businesses and shops near the old courthouse. She passed the grocery store, past the coffee shop where she claimed to meet Linda, kept driving, then she pulled into a parking lot Eduardo knew well. Too well, First National Bank. She'd been telling the truth. She really was going to the bank. But why? Eduardo parked across the street in front of a sandwich shop, positioning himself where he could watch the bank entrance without being obvious. Alida got out of her car, straightened her blouse, and walked inside. Not rushed, not nervous, like she'd done this 1,000 times before, because she had, every Tuesday, for 20 years. Eduardo checked his watch. 11:02 a.m. He'd give her 20 minutes. If she came out in 20 minutes, maybe this was nothing. Maybe she had some perfectly rational explanation. Maybe he was being paranoid and stupid, and he'd owe her the world's biggest apology. But something told him 20 minutes wouldn't be enough. He was right. 45 minutes passed, then an hour. Eduardo sat in his car watching the bank entrance, his mind spinning through possibilities. Was she taking out cash, meeting someone there, working with a banker on some secret account? The rational part of his brain kept insisting there had to be a reasonable explanation. The other part, the part that remembered how she'd hesitated when he asked where she was going, wasn't so sure. At 12:17 p.m., Alita emerged from the bank, but she wasn't alone. A man walked beside her, tall, maybe mid-50s, with silver hair and an expensive-looking charcoal suit. They weren't touching, but there was something about their body language, the way they leaned slightly toward each other, the synchronization of their steps, that made Eduardo's blood run cold. They stood outside the bank entrance for another minute, talking. Alita laughed at something the man said, her hand briefly touching his arm. The gesture looked natural, familiar, like they'd known each other for a long time. Then Alita shook the man's hand, professional, formal, and walked back to her car. The man watched her go before heading to a black Mercedes sedan parked near the entrance. Eduardo's hands were shaking. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. This didn't necessarily mean what it looked like. Maybe the guy was just a bank employee, a financial advisor, someone helping her with something. Legitimate banking business that required meeting every single Tuesday for 2 decades. Even in his own head, it sounded absurd. Alita's car pulled out of the lot, heading back toward their neighborhood. Eduardo didn't follow her. Not yet. Instead, he watched the silver-haired man get into his Mercedes. The guy sat there for a moment, looking at his phone, and then drove off in the opposite direction. Eduardo made another snap decision. He followed the Mercedes. They drove for 15 minutes, leaving downtown Naperville and heading toward the wealthier suburbs. The neighborhoods got nicer, the houses bigger, the lawns more manicured. Finally, the Mercedes turned into the driveway of a sprawling colonial-style home in an exclusive development. Eduardo had driven past 100 times but never entered. The kind of neighborhood where houses started at $1 million. The man got out, grabbed a briefcase from the passenger seat, and walked into the house like he owned it. Because Eduardo realized he probably did. Eduardo sat in his car at the end of the block staring at the house. His phone buzzed. A text from Alita. Feeling better? Making soup for lunch? Love you. He couldn't bring himself to respond. Instead, he pulled up the county property records on his phone. The address was listed under the name Leon Thornton, owner since 2003. Occupation, commercial real estate developer. Estimated property value, $1.4 million. Leon Thornton. The name meant nothing to Eduardo. He'd never heard Alita mention anyone by that name. But they'd met at that bank every Tuesday for years. They had to be connected somehow. The question was how and why. Eduardo drove home in a daze, his mind trying and failing to construct innocent explanations. By the time he pulled into his driveway, Alita's car was already there. He could smell the soup through the front door, her mother's recipe, chicken and vegetables, the comfort food she made when he was sick. She greeted him at the door with a smile. There you are, I was starting to worry. How are you feeling? Better, Eduardo managed. Just needed some air. In your car? Alita's eyes narrowed slightly. I saw you were gone. Drove around the block a few times. Helped with the nausea. It was a terrible lie, but Alita just nodded, leading him into the kitchen. Well, come eat. This'll fix you right up. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd had thousands of meals over 23 years. Alita chatted about Linda, about the lunch they'd supposedly had, about Linda's drama with her homeowners association. She was relaxed, natural, giving no indication that she'd just spent over an hour at a bank meeting with a wealthy real estate developer Eduardo had never heard of. Eduardo played along, responding when appropriate, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating, planning. He needed more information. He needed to understand what he'd seen before he confronted her. Because once he asked the question, once he opened that door, there was no closing it again. After lunch, Alita kissed his forehead and said she had work emails to catch up on. She disappeared into their small home office, leaving Eduardo alone with his thoughts and the remains of the soup neither of them had finished. He pulled out his phone and opened a new search. Leon Thornton, Chicago. The results loaded slowly, each second feeling like an hour. What Eduardo found made his stomach drop. Leon Thornton was more than just a wealthy developer. He'd been involved in a major commercial real estate deal 15 years ago, a deal that had gone south spectacularly. Eduardo clicked through article after article, piecing together a story he'd half forgotten. A shopping center, development that had collapsed, investors losing millions, lawsuits flying in every direction. It had been all over the Chicago news in 2009, 15 years ago. And then Eduardo remembered. His hands went cold. 15 years ago, Alita's father had died. Suddenly, a heart attack at 62. It had devastated Alita, sent her into a depression that lasted months. Eduardo had been there for every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of grief. But there had been something else that year, something about her father's estate. Eduardo stood up and walked to their bedroom, to the filing cabinet where they kept important documents. He rifled through folders until he found the one marked Estate, Robert Brennan, Alita's father. The papers were old, yellowed at the edges. Eduardo scanned through them, looking for something he'd never paid attention to the first time. Most of it was standard. Property transfer, life insurance payout, retirement accounts distributed to Alita and her sister. Nothing unusual. Then he found it. A single sheet tucked between the last two pages. A promissory note, signed by Robert Brennan, dated March 2008, for $185,000, made out to Leon Thornton. Eduardo sank onto the bed, the paper trembling in his hands. His father-in-law had owed Leon Thornton $185,000, and from the date, it looked like that debt had been tied to the shopping center development that had collapsed. Robert Brennan had been an investor, one of the people who'd lost everything, but he'd signed a promissory note, which meant he'd borrowed money from Thornton, personally, and then he died less than a year later, leaving Alita and Linda to deal with the aftermath. The Tuesday suddenly made sickening sense. Alita had been paying off her father's debt for 20 years. Every Tuesday at 10:47 a.m., she'd been meeting with Leon Thornton at that bank, making payments, keeping a secret that would have changed everything Eduardo thought he knew about their marriage. But the math didn't add up. 20 years of payments, even small ones, should have cleared $185,000 by now. Unless there was interest, unless there were penalties, unless Alita had been paying the bare minimum just to keep Thornton from taking legal action against her father's estate, against their family. Eduardo's mind raced through the implications, the sacrifices Alita must have made, the extra shifts at work, the way she'd always been so careful with money, so insistent they didn't need expensive vacations or fancy cars. He'd thought she was just practical, but she'd been carrying a crushing debt in secret, protecting him and their children from a burden that wasn't even hers to bear. And she'd never told him, not once in 20 years. Eduardo heard footsteps in the hallway. Alita appeared in the doorway, stopping when she saw him sitting on the bed with the estate folder open beside him. Her face went pale. "Eduardo, how much do you still owe him?" Eduardo's voice came out flat, controlled, dangerous. Alita's eyes filled with tears. "I can explain." "How much, Alita?" She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had broken behind them, something that had been holding back the weight of 2 decades. $47,000. The number hung between them like a guillotine blade. "After 20 years, Eduardo said slowly, after all those Tuesdays, all those hours, all those payments, you still owe him $47,000? Alita nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "The interest rate. Eduardo, my father was desperate. The terms were predatory. 22% annual interest. I've been paying him $3,000 every month for 20 years, and I've barely made a dent in the principal." Eduardo did the math. $3,000 a month for 20 years. That was $720,000. She'd paid Leon Thornton $720,000 and still owed him $47,000 on an original debt of $185,000. $750,000. Gone. And Eduardo had never known. Why? The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was ashamed. Alita's voice broke. Because my father made a stupid decision and I couldn't let our family lose everything. Thornton threatened to sue the estate, to take my parents' house, to go after Linda. I couldn't let that happen. So I made a deal with him. 20 years of payments. I'd handle it myself. By lying to me for 2 decades? By protecting you, Alita shouted, then immediately lowered her voice. You'd just been laid off when this started. We had 2 small kids, a mortgage. I was working part-time. If I'd told you about this debt, what would you have done? You would have tried to fix it. You would have taken money from our kids' college funds, from our retirement, from everything we were building. I couldn't let you do that. So you did it instead. You sacrificed 20 years, $750,000, and our trust. For what? Alita walked to the bed and sat beside him, but not close enough to touch. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 20 years pressing down on both of them. I need to know everything, Eduardo said finally. No more secrets, no more lies. Tell me the whole story, from the beginning. Alita took a shaky breath and began to speak, and as Eduardo listened to his wife unravel 20 years of secrets, he realized that everything he thought he knew about their marriage had been built on a foundation of silence. The question now was whether that foundation could ever be rebuilt, or if Leon Thornton's predatory deal had destroyed more than just their bank account. They had no idea that Eduardo was already planning something that would finally end Alita's 20-year prison sentence, something that Leon Thornton would never see coming, because Eduardo Patterson wasn't just an operations manager. He'd spent his entire career solving problems, finding inefficiencies, and exploiting weaknesses in systems. And Leon Thornton's predatory loan scheme? That was a system full of holes. Eduardo just needed to find them. Alita's story spilled out in fragments, 20 years of secrets tumbling into the space between them on their bed. Eduardo listened without interrupting, his mind cataloging every detail, every date, every moment his wife had shouldered a burden she thought would crush their family if he knew. It had started in March 2009, 3 weeks after Robert Brennan's funeral. Alita had been drowning in grief, sorting through her father's papers with Linda when they'd found the promissory note. Their mother, already fragile from losing her husband, had nearly collapsed when she understood what it meant. Robert Brennan had invested his life savings, $185,000, in Leon Thornton's shopping center development. When the project collapsed, he'd been desperate to recoup something, anything. Thornton had offered a lifeline, a personal loan with the promise that once Thornton restructured and found new investors, Robert would get his money back plus interest. The shopping center never got built, the restructuring never happened, and Robert Brennan died with $185,000 in debt to a man who had no intention of forgiveness. Thornton showed up at the funeral, Alita said, her voice hollow. Can you imagine? He came to my father's funeral, paid his respects, gave his condolences, and then told me we should talk soon about Robert's outstanding obligations. Like my father was a business transaction that needed closing. Eduardo felt rage building in his chest, hot and sharp. He came to the funeral to collect? 2 days later, he sent a formal demand letter, the full amount plus accumulated interest, due within 30 days. If we didn't pay, he'd file a lawsuit against the estate. Alita wiped her eyes. Mom would have lost the house. Dad had taken a second mortgage to invest in that development. Between the note to Thornton and the bank loan, there was nothing left. Negative equity. If Thornton sued, everything would have been liquidated. Mom would have been homeless. Linda had just had her first baby, and you and we were barely scraping by. So you made a deal. He called it a payment arrangement. 20 years, fixed monthly payments of $3,000, 22% annual interest. He said it was generous, that most lenders would have demanded more. At the time, I didn't understand what I was agreeing to. I just knew I had to protect Mom, protect Linda, protect our family. Eduardo's mind was already working through the numbers, the implications, the sheer audacity of what Thornton had done. How did you hide $3,000 a month from me? I took a second job. Remember when I started doing bookkeeping for Dr. Patterson's dental practice? That wasn't my only client. I had 3 other clients I never told you about. Small businesses that paid cash. I worked nights after you went to bed. Weekends when you were watching the kids. Every penny I made went straight to Thornton. 20 years of stolen sleep. 20 years of working herself to exhaustion. 20 years of lying about where she was every Tuesday morning. The bank meetings, Eduardo said. Why there? Why every Tuesday? Thornton's requirement. He wanted cash payments in person every week. Said it kept me accountable. The bank was neutral ground. He'd meet me there. I'd hand over an envelope with the week's payment. He'd give me a receipt, and we'd both leave. $1,200 a week every Tuesday, like clockwork. For 20 years. Alita nodded. I thought I could pay it off faster. I thought if I worked hard enough, made enough money, I could clear it in 10 years, maybe 15. But the interest kept eating everything. Last year, I finally paid down enough that the interest stopped compounding as fast. I'm in the final stretch now. 18 more months and it's done. 47,000 left, and then I'm free. Eduardo stood up, pacing the bedroom. His wife had been living in a prison of debt for 2 decades, and he'd been completely oblivious. Every time he'd suggested they splurge on a vacation, every time he'd wanted to upgrade their car or renovate the kitchen, Alita had gently redirected them toward more practical choices. He thought she was just sensible. He hadn't known she was bleeding money to a predator who'd shown up at her father's funeral to collect. Why didn't you just tell me after a few years? Eduardo asked. Once we were more stable, once we could have handled it together? Because by then, I'd already lied to you for so long. How do you come back from that? How do you tell your husband, oh, by the way, I've been secretly funneling $3,000 a month to a loan shark for 5 years. Hope you're not mad. Every year that passed made it harder. And every year I told myself I was almost done. Just a few more years. Just a little longer. I could handle it myself. Alita looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. I know I should have told you. I know it was wrong to keep this from you. But Eduardo, I need you to understand. I did it because I love you, because I couldn't stand the thought of this destroying us. Instead, you let it destroy you. The silence that followed was deafening. Eduardo walked to the window looking out at their quiet suburban street. Reasonable houses, reasonable cars, reasonable lives. Everyone playing by reasonable rules. Except Leon Thornton didn't play by any rules but his own. He'd built his $1 million house on the backs of people like Robert Brennan and Alita Patterson. People who'd trusted him, believed in him, and paid for that trust with their savings, their time, their lives. I need to see the documentation, Eduardo said finally. Every receipt, every payment record, every piece of paper Thornton gave you. Can you get them? Alita hesitated. Why? Because I'm not letting you make 18 more. Payments. I'm not letting that bastard take another dollar from our family. Eduardo turned to face her. You've been fighting this alone for 20 years. That ends today. Now we fight together. Something shifted in Alita's expression. Hope, maybe. Or fear. Possibly both. She walked to the closet and pulled down a shoebox from the top shelf. Inside were hundreds of small receipts, each one handwritten in the same neat script, dated and signed by Leon Thornton. 20 years of evidence carefully preserved. Eduardo took the box and began sorting through the receipts. Every Tuesday, $1,200, acknowledged and recorded. He pulled out his laptop and started building a spreadsheet, entering dates and amounts, calculating the actual interest paid versus what should have been paid on a legitimate loan. The numbers told a story that made his blood boil. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel if you have not, because the ending of this story will blow your mind. And drop a comment below telling me what you think Eduardo should do next. Over the next week, Eduardo became obsessed. He took personal days from work, claiming a family emergency that wasn't entirely a lie. He built detailed financial models, researched Illinois usury laws, and dove into Leon Thornton's business history. What he found was a pattern that went far beyond Alita's father. Thornton had been running this scheme for decades. The failed shopping center development had been one of many projects that had collapsed under mysterious circumstances. Each time, small investors lost everything, while Thornton walked away with cash and new opportunities to offer private financing to desperate people trying to recoup their losses. It was elegant in its cruelty. Create the crisis, then profit from it by offering solutions that weren't solutions at all, but just different versions of the same trap. Eduardo found 7 other lawsuits filed against Thornton over the years, all settled out of court with confidentiality agreements. He found complaints with the Better Business Bureau that had gone nowhere. He found a pattern of predatory lending disguised as friendly assistance, of interest rates that should have been illegal but were structured just carefully enough to slip through loopholes in state law. And he found something else, something that made him smile for the first time in days. Leon Thornton was currently under investigation by the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. Not for the old loans. Those were technically legal, if morally reprehensible, but for a new commercial lending operation he'd started in 2022. Someone had filed a complaint about deceptive practices, and the state regulators were quietly building a case. Eduardo picked up his phone and called the number listed for the investigator handling the case. It went to voicemail. He left a detailed message explaining who he was and that he had documentation of Thornton's lending practices going back 20 years. Then he hung up and waited. The call came back within 2 hours. The investigator's name was Jennifer Torres, and she was very interested in what Eduardo had to say. They met the next morning at a coffee shop in downtown Chicago. Torres was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed and professional, with the bearing of someone who'd spent years dealing with financial criminals. "Mr. Patterson," she said as they sat down with their coffees, "you mentioned on your message that your wife has been making payments to Leon Thornton for 20 years? Since 2009. I have all the receipts." Eduardo pulled out the shoebox. Every payment documented. $720,000 paid on an original debt of $185,000. She still owes him $47,000. Torres's eyebrows went up. She pulled out several receipts, examining them carefully. "These are all cash payments?" "Everyone." He insisted on cash in person every Tuesday, which means no bank records, no paper trail beyond these handwritten receipts. Torres smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. That's Thornton's signature move. Cash transactions that are hard to track, hard to prove, hard to use against him. But these receipts, she held one up to the light. "This is gold, Mr. Patterson. This is exactly what I need." "I don't understand. How is this different from the other loans he's made?" "Because of timing. Illinois changed its usury laws in 2011, closing several loopholes that predatory lenders had been exploiting. Thornton's loan to your father-in-law started in 2008, before the change. But here's the thing. He renewed the terms in 2014. Torres pulled out one of the receipts from that year. "See this notation? Loan restructured per agreement. That's a new contract, which means it falls under the 2011 laws. And under those laws, his interest rate is illegal." Eduardo felt something unfold in his chest. Hope, sharp and bright. "So what does that mean?" "It means that every payment your wife made after 2014 was on an illegal loan, which means those payments could be considered void, which means Leon Thornton might owe your wife a substantial refund." Torres leaned forward. "But I need your wife to testify. I need her to tell her story on the record, as part of the investigation. Can she do that?" Eduardo thought about Alida, about the shame and fear she'd been carrying for 20 years, about the way she'd protected him and their children by shouldering a burden that should never have been hers, about the look in her eyes when she'd finally told him the truth. "She can do that," Eduardo said. "She's stronger than anyone knows." Torres nodded. "Then let's take this bastard down." The next Tuesday, Alida didn't go to the bank. For the first time in 20 years, she stayed home at 10:47 a.m., sitting at the kitchen table with Eduardo, drinking coffee and waiting for her phone to ring. It rang at 11:03 a.m., Leon Thornton. "Leo Asha." Alida stared at the screen, her hands shaking. "Answer it," Eduardo said. "On speaker." Alida accepted the call. "Hello?" "Alida." Thornton's voice was smooth, cultured, with an edge of irritation. "You missed our meeting. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Leon. I won't be meeting you anymore." A pause. "Excuse me?" "I said I won't be meeting you anymore. No more payments, no more Tuesdays. We're done." "Alida, I don't think you understand the terms of our agreement. You still owe me $47,000. If you default now, after all these years, I'm not defaulting. I'm calling in an illegal loan. You restructured the terms in 2014 under an interest rate that violates Illinois usury laws, which means every payment I've made since then was on a void contract, which means you're going to refund me approximately $412,000. The silence on the other end was profound. I don't know what you think you've discovered, Thornton said finally, his voice colder now, but I suggest you reconsider this approach. I have lawyers, Alita, very good lawyers. If you try to fight me on this, I will bury you in legal fees. You'll lose everything. No, Alita said, and Eduardo heard steel in her voice he'd never heard before. You'll lose everything, because I'm not fighting you alone anymore. My husband knows. The state investigators know. And they're very interested in your lending practices, Leon. All of them. Going back decades. Another pause, longer this time. When Thornton spoke again, the smoothness was gone. You're making a mistake. The only mistake I made was letting you control my life for 20 years. That ends now. Alita hung up. Her hands were shaking, but she was smiling. For the first time in 2 decades, she'd told Leon Thornton no. Eduardo reached across the table and took her hand. How do you feel? Terrified, exhilarated, free. Alita laughed, a sound that was half sob. What happens now? Now we wait for Torres to do her job. She's bringing in the full weight of the state regulatory system. They'll audit Thornton's records, interview his other victims, build a case that he can't buy or threaten his way out of. And if he comes after us, if he tries to, he won't, because anything he does now just adds to the case against him. He's smart enough to know when he's caught. At least, I hope he is. But Eduardo underestimated Leon Thornton's arrogance and his desperation, because men like Thornton don't go down quietly. They fight, they scheme, they do whatever it takes to protect their empires, even if it means destroying innocent people in the process. 3 days after Alita's phone call, Eduardo came home from work to find their house had been broken into. Nothing valuable was taken. The TV was still there. Alita's jewelry was untouched. Their laptops were right where they'd left them. But the filing cabinet in their bedroom was open, drawers pulled out, papers scattered across. The floor. Someone had been looking for something. The shoebox of receipts was gone. Eduardo called Torres immediately. He took them. Thornton took all the receipts. Are you sure it was him? Who else would want 20 years of payment records? He's trying to eliminate the evidence. Torres was quiet for a moment. Mr. Patterson, do you still have the spreadsheet you built? The one with all the dates and amounts? Yes, but without the original receipts. But you photographed them, right? Before you met with me? Eduardo froze. He hadn't. He'd been so focused on organizing the physical documents that he'd never thought to make digital copies. The only evidence of Alita's 20-year ordeal was now in Leon Thornton's hands, probably feeding a shredder in his million-dollar home. We're screwed, Eduardo said. Without those receipts, we're not screwed. We're just going to have to be smarter. Torres's voice was calm, controlled. Thornton made a mistake. Breaking and entering, theft of evidence in an active investigation, that's serious. We'll get a warrant for his house, his office, his car. If he still has those receipts, we'll find them. If he destroyed them, we'll prove that too. Either way, he just handed us more ammunition. But Eduardo knew it wasn't that simple. Thornton had money, connections, lawyers who could spin breaking and entering into concerned creditor protecting his financial interests, or some other bullshit that would stick in court. They needed more than a break-in. They needed irrefutable proof. They needed Thornton to incriminate himself. And Eduardo knew exactly how to make that happen. Torres, he said slowly, what if Alita made one more payment? One final Tuesday meeting? What are you thinking? I'm thinking Thornton is scared right now. Scared enough to break into our house? Scared enough to steal evidence? If Alita calls him, says she's reconsidered, says she wants to make a deal to keep this quiet, he'll jump at it. You want to wear a wire. I want to record him admitting what he did. The illegal interest rate, the restructured loan, the break-in, everything. Get him talking, get him comfortable, get him to hang himself with his own words. Torres was quiet again. That's risky. If he suspects anything, he won't, because Alita will be genuinely terrified. She doesn't have to pretend to be scared of him. She's been scared of him for 20 years. Eduardo looked at Alita, who'd been listening to the whole conversation. She was pale, but her jaw was set with determination. She nodded. "One more Tuesday," Alita said. "One more meeting, and then I'm done with Leon Thornton forever." Torres agreed to the plan with conditions. Alita would wear a wire, but Eduardo would be nearby with backup officers. The meeting would be in a public place. Not the bank, somewhere more isolated where Thornton might feel comfortable speaking freely. And at the first sign of danger, they'd pull Alita out. The next Tuesday couldn't come fast enough. And when it did, Eduardo and Alita would walk into that meeting knowing that everything they'd built together, their trust, their marriage, their future, depended on what happened in the next hour. Leon Thornton thought he'd won by stealing those receipts. He thought he'd intimidated them back into submission. He thought wrong, because Eduardo Patterson had spent 23 years married to the strongest woman he'd ever known. And together, they were about to show Leon Thornton exactly what happened when you pushed a quiet family too far. The trap was set, Tuesday was coming, and Leon Thornton's empire of predatory lending was about to come crashing down around him. The Tuesday morning air was crisp and cold, late November settling over Chicago, with that particular gray heaviness that promised snow. Alita sat in her car in the parking lot of Oakwood Park, a quiet nature preserve on the outskirts of Naperville. She'd suggested this location to Thornton, somewhere private where we can talk openly, and he'd agreed immediately. Too immediately. Eduardo had been right. Thornton was desperate. The wire taped to Alita's chest felt conspicuous, though Torres had assured her it was completely hidden beneath her sweater. Eduardo was parked 3 rows back in an unmarked van with Torres and 2 other investigators, listening to every sound through Alita's microphone. 3 squad cars were positioned at the park entrances, ready to move in if needed. Alita's phone buzzed. A text from Eduardo. "You don't have to do this. We can find another way." She typed back, "Yes, I do. For me. 20 years, remember?" At 10:47 a.m., Leon Thornton's black Mercedes pulled into the lot. Alita watched him get out, straightening his expensive suit jacket, looking around the empty park with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never faced real consequences in his life. He walked toward her car, and Alita forced herself to get out and meet him halfway. "Alita!" Thornton's smile was warm, friendly, completely artificial. "Thank you for reconsidering. I knew we could resolve this like reasonable adults." "I'm not here to reconcile, Leon. I'm here to understand what happens next." His smile tightened. "What happens next depends entirely on you. Drop this investigation nonsense. Make your remaining payments as agreed, and we can all move on with our lives. Continue down this path." He shrugged. "Well, legal battles are expensive, time-consuming, stressful. I'd hate to see you and Eduardo lose everything fighting a case you can't win." "Can't win? You restructured an illegal loan, Leon. The evidence is clear." "Was clear." Thornton's smile widened. "But evidence has a way of disappearing, doesn't it? Those receipts you were so proud of. Where are they now? You broke into my house. Did I? Or did you simply misplace some old papers? These things happen." He stepped closer, and Alita fought the urge to step back. "Here's what I know. Alita, you've been paying me $3,000 a month for 20 years because you agreed to. You signed a contract. You honored that contract. And now because your husband got involved and started making noise, you think you can just walk away? That's not how this works. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you would have done in Alita's situation." Alita took a breath, remembering Torres's instructions. Keep him talking. Get him to admit everything. The restructuring in 2014, that was after Illinois changed the usury laws. You knew the interest rate was illegal then, didn't you? Illegal is such a strong word. The law has always been interpretable. My lawyers assured me the restructuring was compliant. At 22% interest? You agreed to the terms, Alita. You could have walked away at any time. Could I? Because every time I mentioned maybe consulting a lawyer, you reminded me what would happen to my mother's house, to my sister's financial stability. You kept me trapped with threats. Thornton's expression hardened. I kept you trapped? You came to me, remember? You begged me for a payment plan. I could have demanded the full amount immediately and buried your family in lawsuits. Instead, I gave you a chance to settle the debt honorably. If that feels like a trap to you, maybe you should reconsider your definition of generosity. Generosity? You've taken $720,000 from me on a debt of $185,000, plus interest, plus administrative fees, plus the considerable inconvenience of tracking payments for 20 years. Thornton pulled out his phone. But I'm a reasonable man, Alita. I'm willing to make this all go away. $47,000 paid in full by the end of the month, and we call it even. No more Tuesdays, no more meetings, no more obligations. Just one final payment and you're free. Alita felt anger rising in her chest, hot and bright. Free? I've given you 20 years of my life, Leon. 20 years of working extra jobs, hiding money from my husband, lying to my family. 20 years of fear and shame because my father trusted the wrong person. And you think you can just take one more payment and we're done. I think you don't have a choice. Thornton's voice went cold. Because without those receipts, you have no case. It's your word against mine. And my word, backed by my lawyers, my reputation, my resources, will always win over the word of a part-time bookkeeper from Naperville. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to make your final payment. You're going to tell your husband to drop this crusade, and you're going to tell those state investigators that you were mistaken, that you misunderstood the loan terms. Do that, and this ends quietly. Don't. He leaned in close enough that Alita could smell his cologne. Don't, and I will destroy you, your marriage, your family, your reputation. I have connections, Alita. Judges, prosecutors, reporters. By the time I'm done, Eduardo will believe you were having an affair with me for 20 years. Your children will read about it in the news. Your mother will die knowing her daughter was a liar and a cheat. Is that what you want? Alita stared at him. This man who'd held power over her for 2 decades. This man who'd profited from her father's death, from her fear, from her love for her family. And something inside her, something that had been compressed and contained for 20 years, finally broke free. You know what, Leon? You're right about one thing. I don't have the receipts anymore. You stole them when you broke into my house, but here's what you're wrong about. Alita smiled, and it was genuine. You think you're the only one who can make threats? You think you're the only one with connections? My husband spent the last 2 weeks building a case against you that goes far beyond my father's loan. He found 7 other families you've victimized. He found documentation of your patterns going back 30 years, and he gave all of it to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. Thornton's face went pale. You're bluffing. Am I? Jennifer Torres sends her regards, by the way. She's very interested in your lending practices, especially the new operation you started in 2022. Turns out threatening small business owners into predatory loans is frowned upon by state regulators. Who knew? You have nothing. No evidence, no case, no... I have your confession. Alita tapped her chest, right where the wire was hidden. Every word you just said, the threats, the break-in, the illegal interest rate, all of it, recorded, admissible. Game over, Leon. The color drained from Thornton's face. He took a step back, his eyes darting around the parking lot as if seeing it for the first time. The unmarked van, the patrol cars at the exits, the trap closing around him. You set me up. I got you to tell the truth. There's a difference. Alita raised her voice slightly. Did you get all that? The van doors opened. Jennifer Torres stepped out, followed by Eduardo and 2 uniformed officers. They walked across the parking lot with the purposeful stride of people who'd been waiting for this moment. Leon Thornton, Torres said, pulling out her badge. I'm Special Investigator Jennifer Torres with the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. We need to talk about your business practices. Specifically, we need to talk about breaking and entering, theft of evidence, witness intimidation, and approximately 30 years of predatory lending. Thornton looked at Alita, and for the first time since she'd met him 15 years ago, she saw something other than confidence in his eyes. She saw fear. You don't understand what you've done, he said quietly. Do you have any idea how powerful my friends are? The lawyers I can hire? You think this is Over, but it's just beginning. I will tie you up in court for years. You'll do nothing, Eduardo said, stepping forward. He'd been silent until now, letting Alita have her moment, but his voice carried an edge that made Thornton stop mid-sentence. Because your friends, your lawyers, they're not going to help you when the state brings criminal charges. They're not going to help you when the other families you victimized come forward. And they're certainly not going to help you when every reporter in Chicago hears about the wealthy developer who made his fortune stealing from grieving families. Torres nodded to the officers. Mr. Thornton, we're going to need you to come with us. You're not under arrest yet, but we have questions that require answers. I suggest you cooperate fully. As the officers escorted Thornton to an unmarked car, he looked back at Alita one last time. This isn't over. Yes, Alita said quietly. It is. They watched the car drive away, Thornton's face pale through the window. Alita felt Eduardo's hand slip into hers, warm and solid and real. You were incredible, he said. I was terrified. You were both. He pulled her into a hug, and Alita let herself lean into him, let herself finally feel the weight of 20 years lifting off her shoulders. Torres walked over, pulling off her headset. We got everything we needed. The confession alone is enough to start criminal proceedings. Add in the break-in, the threats, and the documentation your husband compiled. She smiled. Leon Thornton is going to be very busy for the next few years. What happens now? Alita asked. Now we build the case. Interview the other victims your husband identified. Audit Thornton's financial records. It'll take time, but I'm confident we can prove a pattern of predatory lending that spans decades. As for your specific situation, Torres pulled out a folder. Based on what we've uncovered, I believe you're entitled to a full refund of all payments made after the 2014 restructuring. That comes to approximately $412,000, plus potentially more if we can prove coercion in the original loan agreement. $412,000. Alita felt dizzy. I never believed I'd see any of it back. Believe it. Men like Thornton build their empires on the assumption that people like you won't fight back. You proved him wrong. Torres closed the folder. It'll take some time to process everything through the courts, but I'll keep you updated on our progress. In the meantime, go home. Be with your family. Stop going to banks on Tuesday mornings. Alita laughed, a sound that was part relief, part disbelief, part joy. I think I can manage that. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings, interviews, and news coverage. The story broke in the Chicago Tribune first. Wealthy developer accused of decades-long predatory lending scheme. By the end of the week, every major news outlet in Illinois was running variations of the story. Reporters camped outside Thornton's house, photographing the for sale sign that went up on his lawn. His commercial real estate company lost 3 major contracts within days. His country club membership was quietly revoked. But the most satisfying moment came 6 weeks later, when Alita and Eduardo sat in a downtown Chicago courtroom and watched Leon Thornton stand before a judge to answer formal charges. Criminal usury, wire fraud, witness intimidation, breaking and entering. The list went on, each charge carrying years of potential prison time. Thornton's lawyers had tried everything: motions to dismiss, claims of procedural errors, arguments about the admissibility of the recorded conversation. Nothing worked. The evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear, the confession too damning. The judge set bail at $500,000. Thornton's face, watching him realize he'd have to liquidate assets just to stay out of jail pending trial, was something Alita would remember forever. Outside the courthouse, Torres pulled them aside. I have news. The state's attorney is offering Thornton a plea deal. If he agrees to surrender his lending license, pay full restitution to all identified victims, and accept a suspended prison sentence with 5 years probation, they'll drop the most serious charges. What does that mean for us? Eduardo asked. It means you'd get your money back faster. Full restitution, $412,000, plus the $47,000 in remaining debt that you never actually owed. Total of $459,000. It would be processed within 60 days rather than waiting years for a criminal trial to conclude. Alita looked at Eduardo. They'd discuss this possibility, the choice between maximum punishment and practical recovery. What about the other families? They'd all get full restitution, too. 8 families total, nearly $2 million returned. Thornton would be financially ruined, but would avoid prison. And if we don't accept the deal, we go to trial. Could take 2 years, maybe more. Thornton might end up in prison, but recovery of funds becomes much more complicated. His assets could be tied up in appeals indefinitely. Alita thought about Leon Thornton in prison, thought about the satisfaction of watching him behind bars. Then she thought about the other families, people who'd been victimized just like her, waiting years for justice that might never fully come. Take the deal, Alita said. Get everyone their money back. That's what matters. Torres nodded. I'll let the state's attorney know. You're making the right choice. 2 months later, on a Tuesday morning, the timing felt cosmically appropriate. Alita received a direct deposit for $459,000. She and Eduardo sat at the kitchen table, staring at their bank app, watching the number that had seemed impossible become real. What do we do with it? Alita asked. Eduardo had already been thinking about this. The kids' college loans, pay them off completely, put some in retirement, take that vacation we've been putting off for 20 years, and maybe... He reached across the table to take her hand. Maybe we use some of it to help other people who got caught in situations like yours. Families dealing with predatory lenders, people who don't know their rights. Alita smiled. A foundation? Like a real organization? Why not? You spent 20 years helping a predator. Now you can spend the next 20 helping his victims. The idea took root quickly. Within 6 months, the Brennan Foundation for Financial Justice was officially incorporated, funded partially by Alita's restitution and partially by donations from the other families Thornton had victimized. They hired lawyers to provide free consultations for people dealing with suspicious loans. They created educational programs about financial literacy and predatory lending warning signs. They worked with Torres and other state investigators to identify and report other schemes before they could trap families the way Thornton had trapped the Brennans. Alita discovered she was good at it. The advocacy, the education, the patient work of helping people understand their rights and find their courage. She'd spent 20 years hiding. Now she stood in front of community groups and church gatherings and school assemblies, telling her story, making sure other people knew they didn't have to carry their burdens alone. As for Leon Thornton, the plea deal meant he avoided prison, but his life as he'd known it was over. His real estate empire collapsed. His mansion sold at a loss to cover restitution payments. His reputation was destroyed beyond repair. The last Eduardo heard, Thornton was working as a sales associate at a car dealership in Rockford, living in a 1-bedroom apartment, driving a 10-year-old sedan. Not prison, but a different kind of punishment. The daily humiliation of ordinary life after decades of feeling untouchable. One evening, nearly a year after that final Tuesday in Oakwood Park, Alita and Eduardo sat on their back deck, watching the sun set over their neighborhood. They'd paid off both kids' loans. They'd taken a 2-week trip to Italy. They'd renovated the basement and fixed the leak and done all the things they'd been putting off. But mostly they'd talked, really talked, about trust and secrets and the weight of carrying burdens alone. Do you forgive me? Alita asked quietly. For lying to you for 20 years? Eduardo was quiet for a long moment. I understand why you did it. I understand you were trying to protect us. But Alita, we're partners. We're supposed to face things together. You took that away from me, from us. I know. But I also know that you carried an impossible weight with grace and strength I can't even imagine. You protected our family when you thought I couldn't. Handle the truth. That doesn't make the lying okay, but it makes it understandable. He turned to look at her. So yes, I forgive you, as long as you promise no more secrets, no more protecting me from hard truths. We face everything together from now on. Deal. Alita leaned her head on his shoulder. I'm sorry it took me so long to trust you with this. I'm sorry I didn't pay closer attention. I should have noticed you were struggling. You noticed when it mattered. That's what counts. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky fade from orange to purple to deep blue. Somewhere in Naperville, other families were sitting down to dinner, living their ordinary lives, carrying their hidden struggles. Some of them would find their way to the Brennan Foundation. Some would discover, as Alita had, that the secrets they'd been carrying alone didn't have to define them. That asking for help wasn't weakness. That justice, while sometimes slow, was possible. Alita thought about her father, about the desperate decision he'd made that had set all of this in motion. She'd been angry at him for years, for trusting Thornton, for leaving them with his debt, for dying before she could ask him why. But somewhere over the past year, the anger had transformed into something softer. Understanding, maybe. Compassion. Her father had made a mistake. He tried to fix it. And when he couldn't, his daughter had spent 20 years paying for it because she loved him. That wasn't a failure. That was family. I learned something through all this, Alita said. Something I want to teach other people. What's that? That revenge isn't about destroying the people who hurt you. It's about refusing to let them destroy you. Thornton took 20 years of my life, but he didn't take my integrity. He didn't take my love for you and the kids. He didn't take the person I am underneath all that debt and fear. In the end, I won because I stayed myself, and he lost because he forgot how to be human. Eduardo squeezed her hand. That's what you should tell people. That's the lesson they need to hear. Think anyone will listen? I think you'd be surprised how many people are carrying their own Tuesday morning secrets, waiting for someone to tell them it's okay to ask for help, to fight back, to stop letting predators define their worth. He smiled. You're going to help a lot of people, Alita Patterson. She smiled back. We're going to help a lot of people. Together. The stars came out one by one over Naperville. The same stars that had witnessed Alita's 20 years of silent struggle, her weekly pilgrimages to a bank parking lot, her quiet acts of sacrifice that no one knew about until they did. But now those Tuesdays were just memories. The debt was paid, the predator was defeated, and Alita was free to live the life she'd been putting on hold for 2 decades. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living well despite the people who tried to break you. It's turning your pain into purpose and your struggle into strength. It's refusing to let your story end with defeat and instead writing a new chapter where the victims become victors and the weak become warriors. Alita had learned that lesson the hard way. Now she'd spend the rest of her life teaching it to others. And every time she helped someone stand up to their own Leon Thornton, every time she saw a family reclaim their power from a predator, she'd remember that cold November morning in Oakwood Park when she finally said no, when she finally chose herself, when she finally understood that the greatest act of love isn't suffering in silence. It's trusting the people you love with your truth. That was her legacy. Not the debt, not the lies, not the 20 years of Tuesdays, but the courage to stop running, to face her fear, and to build something beautiful from the ashes of what Leon Thornton had tried to destroy. If you enjoyed this story, like this video and leave a comment telling me what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to get alerts for new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.